office in July of 2012, you know, sort of setting up the schedule for the year, I thought, boy, February 15th, that'll be great. That'll be the perfect day. Well, it turns out that February 15th is day 4 of a 3-day weekend. So, so none but the brave actually turn up for seminars on Friday afternoon before President's Day. So I'm particularly grateful to all of you for coming. And as I told Heather, you know, we didn't get the numbers today, but we got the right people, so that we're absolutely delighted that you're here. I'm happy to introduce Heather Hough today, and I will make apologies on behalf of Susanna Loeb, who is the co-author of this paper, but who also sort of took the counsel of a majority of people in Sacramento and said, shoot, you know, hey, Monday's President's Day, I'm going to stay at Stanford. So, so Heather is going to bravely produce the seminar on her own today. But I'm happy to introduce Heather for 2 reasons. One is that Heather was one of our doctoral students at Stanford, and the research that she is going to present today was conducted at Stanford partly under PACE auspices. But the second is that as a doctoral graduate of Stanford, Heather decided that her primary professional commitment was not to publishing lots of articles in scholarly journals, which she will certainly do, but which most of our students spend their entire lives doing, but that she was committed to working on California education policy. And so instead of taking an academic job, she has gone to work for Public Policy Institute of California and is now a colleague in a new sense in that she will be part of the community of people who is working on education issues with an eye to how we improve California's education system. So I'm glad to welcome her to our fraternity / sorority of people who work on these issues, and congratulate her on completing her dissertation, and welcome her to today's seminar.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope that this will be the perfect kickoff to your long weekend. I have a microphone here in case anyone in the back is having trouble hearing me. Can you guys hear me okay back there? Yeah? Okay. Let me know if you can't at any point, or if you have trouble seeing anything up on the screen. And also let me know if you have any questions. There will be time at the end of the presentation for questions, but please pipe up if you have any questions as I'm going through. So today I'll be talking about the role of compensation in teacher recruitment and retention. But first, I want to step back and talk about what the problem is. So as many of you probably know, there are variations between districts in the amount of salary that teachers make. In California, district salaries range from $42,000 to over $110,000. And that's for teachers with the exact same years of experience and education units. And so if you're thinking about a teacher who's deciding between 2 jobs, that difference in compensation can be very powerful. What ends up happening in our state and in many states is that districts with high-need students have the lowest salaries. And I want to point out quickly what this ends up looking like. So what you see here is a comparison between the highest salary districts and the lowest salary districts. And you can see that the highest salary districts have fewer minority students, have fewer English language learners. And so what this ends up producing is that the lower salary plus what may be perceived as more difficult working conditions often leads to a difficulty for the school districts with higher proportions of minority kids or English language learners in recruiting and retaining teachers, which leads to a disparity in many indicators of teacher quality. And again, I want to point out here, now this compares high minority and low minority districts. So the high minority districts have more newly hired teachers, more teachers with a BA or less, more teachers with less than 3 years of experience, and more teachers without credentials. So this is a big problem across our state, and something that we talk about improving in a lot of different ways. So one of the solutions that's batted around is compensation. And indeed, districts often do use compensation to attract and retain teachers, and the compensation can look like higher salaries. It can look like targeted incentives for certain subjects for certain schools. But we don't know very much about whether this is an effective strategy. We do know that teachers are deciding between many things when they decide to accept or remain in a position. And compensation may be one of those, but we don't have a lot of evidence about whether or not that's effective. So the real question here is, will wages help attract and retain teachers? There's research literature that suggests that when teachers are making the decision to become or remain teachers, that compensation can make a difference. So there's been some studies looking at system-wide effects, both nationally and some here in the state of California, that shows that if you raise salaries over a period of time, more teachers decide to be teachers and retention rates go up systemically. But there's very little evidence on whether district salary increases can affect recruitment or retention, particularly within an urban school district. So if there's a relative salary increase for a place that's been historically low salary, can that change recruitment and retention outcomes for that district? And in the area of teacher applicants and teacher recruitment, there's even less research on kind of the mechanism of how changes to compensation could affect teacher recruitment. So any existing research that does look at differential salary increases looks at where teachers end up. And so it says, of the teachers that are hired, maybe they're better, maybe they're different because an introduction of a higher salary was introduced. But really, teacher recruitment is a very complex process that involves people applying to districts interviewing teachers, schools interviewing teachers, and then hiring them. So really, to fully understand the effect of compensation on recruitment, you need to look at that whole process, not just who ends up being hired on the back end. And so to add some evidence to this discussion and to the way that we think about how compensation could affect future recruitment and retention, I study a policy in San Francisco. It's the Quality Teacher and Education Act. QTEA is a parcel tax that was passed by San Francisco voters in June of 2008. As when it was passed, it provided about $500 per student for 20 years. Now, it was envisioned as a comprehensive teacher quality approach, and it included interventions in teacher support, accountability, and compensation. I'm just going to detail these very briefly. The policy included a master teacher program, professional development hours, expansion of the district support program for the lowest performing teachers, peer assistance and review, and a whole school rewards program that incentivized innovative behaviors at the school level. But the focus of the work that I'll be presenting today is on QTEA's compensation elements. And what those included was a salary increase for teachers on the salary schedule that ranged from $500 to over $6,000, a hard-to-staff school bonus of $2,000, a hard-to-fill subject bonus of $1,000, and retention bonuses for teachers after their 4th year of service in the district and their 8th year of service in the district. And so specifically, I'll be looking at whether these interventions impacted the district's ability to recruit and retain teachers. Now, briefly go over the data collection, although I'll drill down a little bit more into the data used to answer the various questions. We had a very multi-pronged approach in understanding both the implementation and effect of this policy. We analyzed administrative data from the district over the past 10 years, surveys of teachers and principals, of teacher applicants, interviews with district staff and stakeholders, and school case studies where we really dug into what was happening at the school level. Now, what I'll be covering today is the effect of QTEA's compensation increases on teacher recruitment and teacher retention, and I'm just going to delve right into the effect on teacher recruitment. And so I want to show you what the focus of research will be in understanding QTEA's effect on teacher recruitment. The main thing that I look at in this research is QTEA's overall salary increase. So I want to give you an idea of how QTEA changed teacher salaries within San Francisco Unified compared to some of the other local districts in the labor market. So what you see here is the time period before and after the passage of the policy, and San Francisco compared to several other districts in the local labor market. This blue line here is San Francisco, and what you'll see is that most of the other districts during this time period had very flat salaries. Some had a couple % increase, but for teachers with 2 prior years of experience, teachers received a very large increase relative to the other districts in the same time period. And what you'll see here is that San Francisco went higher than San Jose Unified, closer to really traditionally high salary districts like Palo Alto, and then which is up here, and then significantly higher than other local urban districts like Oakland. And so I want to talk about how QTEA might affect recruitment, which really provides the framework for how I look at this question. So if QTEA was effective in attracting teacher applicants, then on one hand, we would expect that more teachers would apply to work in the district. So you could imagine of every teacher that's thinking about a job in the labor market, If salaries are higher, then they say, sure, I'll consider San Francisco in the list of districts that I apply to. And that might just create more people in the applicant pool. You also might imagine that teachers who would have only applied to districts that were higher salary before QTEA now apply to San Francisco. So teachers say, I only want to work in Palo Alto and Walnut Creek, but now that San Francisco is closer to those places, I'll include it in the portfolio of districts that I apply to. And what kind of follows from this is that some of these new teacher applicants might actually be higher quality. And I want to tell you a little bit about what the economic literature says about teachers and specifically about workers and why and how they're drawn to higher salaries. So the economic literature says that people that have higher productivity or that are higher quality workers are drawn to higher salaries because they want to be compensated for what they know they contribute to their job. And in teaching, where teachers are not generally compensated for their quality, one of the ways that teachers can get more money is by moving to another district. Most of the variation in districts in salaries in California is at the district level. And so a way that teachers make more money is by moving to districts that have higher salaries. And so the literature then would suggest that some of these people who are drawn to the higher salaries are doing it because they believe they could get a job there and might be higher quality applicants. And so in this analysis, I proxy teachers who apply to higher paying districts as higher quality applicants. I also would really like to point out that this is a piece of theory that is important to take into account, but it also just matters from a policy perspective. If you introduce an increase in compensation, then what you'd want is for teachers to respond to that compensation. And one of the ways they would be responding is by including San Francisco in a host of higher salary districts that they're now applying to. And so a visual of how we might expect QTEA to affect recruitment is that the introduction of QTEA leads to an increase in the district's appeal. More people now say, San Francisco seems like a good place to work because, like I said, they're really weighing lots of different things when they consider where they might like to work. Compensation is one of them, location, working conditions, the students that are in the schools in that district. This would lead to changes in the applicant pool. It might increase the quantity of applicants, just more people apply to San Francisco, which would mean that if the district selects from this pool well, it would increase the quality of the newly hired teachers in the district. Another option is that the quality increases, that people who are drawn by the higher salary are higher quality candidates. And in this case, even if San Francisco selects randomly, then the quality of the new hires should go up. And like I said, the few research studies that look at the effect of a differential salary increase in a school district look just at this piece. But really understanding how the applicant pool changes and how changes in the applicant pool are related to changes in the cohorts of new hires is a really important thing to understand the mechanism here. And so before I get into some of the methods and the findings, I want to share some results from a survey that we did in 2008 and 2010. We asked principals to tell us how satisfied they were with the quality of applicants, of their external hires. And in 2008, they were much less satisfied than in 2010. You'll see here 53% were very satisfied after the introduction of the policy. Principals said things like, this year there's just a lot of stronger teachers coming in to interview. But they also said things like, I used to have a hard time recruiting teachers in hard to fill areas, but last year because of the economy, and it's going to be the same this year, there are a lot of candidates out there. So anytime that we asked principals and teachers about what they decided and how they decided, the economy was really tied up with the policy. And I want to point out exactly why that's true. So this is the timeline of QTEA implementation. It was fully implemented in 2009-10, which, as you'll see, corresponded with a downturn in the economy almost at the exact same time that the policy was introduced. So this year's unemployment in the Bay Area over the time that before and after QTEA was passed, it was the highest that it had been in many years in the first year of full implementation of the policy. And so in any time, a causal approach to isolating the effect of a policy is very important. But in this case, it's especially important because there were such dramatic changes in the economy at that time. And really, changes in the economy could affect teacher recruitment in a lot of very important ways because there aren't as many available positions, perhaps, in school districts, or there aren't as many available positions in other professions. And so, or people might be getting laid off from prior positions. And so it really changes the dynamics of the workforce, and particularly recruitment into new professions or into different professions for an individual. So the goal here is that we need an approach that allows us to compare teachers who are similarly affected by the economy or by any other change that's happening at the same time, but who are differently affected by the policy. And so what I do is I exploit natural variation in the salary increases. So what you see here is that this is for teachers with a BA plus 60 on the salary schedule in San Francisco. And what you'll see is that teachers who had fewer years of experience stood to gain quite a bit by the policy. And teachers that had more years of experience stood to gain much less. And so you might expect that QTEA would differentially impact these teachers that stood to gain a lot. But maybe not as much for teachers that would have stood to gain not as much as a result of the policy. But we want to compare only teachers in this range of experience, because first and second year teachers are very different from fifth year teachers, for example. Maybe they don't have a job yet, maybe they got laid off from their previous position. And people at this range of experience also may be different. They may be considering retirement, and the economy might really change the way that they are thinking about their career in general. And so what we want to do is compare just teachers with 2 to 15 years of prior experience. Even though teachers with 2 to 15 years of experience are different, they really shouldn't be differently affected by the economy. The economy should affect them in the same way. And so by comparing teachers who were targeted by the policy to teachers that were not targeted by the policy, we can see how QTEA might have affected the teachers who were targeted compared to those who weren't. This is an important point. Does everybody see where I'm going with this? Okay. So specifically, the research questions around teacher recruitment are first about changes to the applicant pool. Did QTEA attract more applicants in the targeted areas? Did QTEA attract applicants from higher paying school districts? And then understanding changes to the cohorts of new hires. Did San Francisco hire more teachers in areas that were targeted by QTEA? And did QTEA improve the quality of the new hires in San Francisco? To answer these questions, I use a broad source of data that I pulled together. To understand changes to the applicant pool, I create cohorts of applicants from 2005 to 2011 that represent all of the applicants to the district, including those who were hired and those who were not hired. And this is based on teacher and applicant surveys. This database contains placement on the San Francisco salary schedule, as well as a comprehensive list of all of the local school districts that the teacher applied to at the same time he or she applied to San Francisco Unified. To study changes in the cohorts of new hires, I use San Francisco's administrative data to look at the cohorts of new hires before and after the policy. And this contains teachers' actual placements on the San Francisco salary schedule and year-by-year contributions, estimations of a teacher's contribution to student learning of the students in their classroom. So the first question here is, did QTEA attract more applicants in targeted areas? So again, the approach here is to compare the proportion of targeted applicants before and after QTEA. So an increase in the proportion of targeted applicants in the pool before to after QTEA would indicate that there were more applicants, that more people had applied to work in San Francisco in the targeted group, and that they were drawn by the salary. It provides an indication of this. It also provides an indication that the size of the applicant pool increased. Again, here I limit the sample to those with 2 to 15 years of prior experience to make sure I'm comparing teachers who were similarly affected by the economy or other secular trends, but differently affected by QTEA. And what I find here is that yes, QTEA did attract more people in the targeted areas. So what you'll see here is that before QTEA, 27% of the teachers in the applicant pool were in this targeted group. After, 37% were in the targeted group. It's a significant difference, and a difference of 10 percentage points. So more people were now in the pool in the targeted group than before the introduction of the policy, which again provides an indication that the quantity of applicants in the pool increased directly in response to QTEA. The second part of this question is, did QTEA attract applicants from higher paying school districts? So the approach here is to compare the average salary of the other districts that applicants applied to before and after QTEA. And an increase here in the average salary of the other districts which show that the teachers were drawn by the salary. And again, I want to talk about 2 points. One is how I created this measure. So again, like I said, I asked teachers to tell me all of the districts that they had applied to at the time they applied to San Francisco. And I used that information to take public data and estimate the average of all of the districts that they had applied to. So kind of the average salary of their portfolio. And if the average salary goes up for those targeted applicants, it means that their portfolio of districts was higher after the introduction of the policy, meaning that QTEA was effective in drawing in people who previously might not have applied to San Francisco. Again, here I limit the sample to folks with 2 to 15 years of prior experience to really make sure I'm comparing similar groups of people. And so what I'm showing you here is the results. I used a difference in difference approach. And I'm going to walk through the findings, but in a nutshell, the answer is yes, QTEA was effective in pulling in folks who had a higher preference for salary. Now, a difference in difference approach, what it essentially does is it compares the non-targeted group, which is really a control group, to the targeted group. Now, the control group, this non-targeted group, is the way that we would expect teachers to have behaved in the absence of the policy. And then we compare them to what happened for the targeted group, that was exposed to the policy, to understand the differences. So what you can see here is that for the non-targeted group, before to after the introduction of the policy, the average salary of the district that they applied to actually went down. And this is exactly what we would expect. We would expect that in a down economy, the districts that have the highest salaries don't have positions. And so people, if they're looking for jobs, are going outside of the higher paying districts into lower paying districts that traditionally have more supply. But for the targeted group, during the same time period, we see that the average salary of districts actually went up, which means that for these teachers, they were applying to a portfolio of higher salary districts after the introduction of the policy, which is what we would expect, given what I've hypothesized about a potential effect of QTEA. Now, the real effect here is the difference between what we saw and what we would have expected for this group in the absence of QTEA. So what we would have expected for the targeted group is that their slope would have looked something like the non-targeted group. It would have looked like this. Because in the absence of QTEA, they would have mimicked what happened for the control group, for the non-targeted group. So the real difference here is the QTEA effect, is that applicants to the district after the policy applied to other districts that were $2,255 higher salary on average than they would have in the absence of the policy.
I'm not sure if this, would you be able to demonstrate that the districts that have the higher paying salaries had fewer applicants? In other words, because what I'm asking is, if the data is based on the question of teachers who applied to the district in San Francisco and other districts they applied to, but we don't have the data set of teachers who decided not to apply to San Francisco.
Right.
But so I'm just wondering if you were able to determine whether or not is there increased competition, literally, such that other districts had a downward trend in their applicant pool?
Mm-hmm. Anecdotally, we believe that that's true.
Yeah.
We talk to other districts. We don't have the kind of data systems in the labor market to be able to look at all of the districts. And ideally, that's what you would want to do. You would want to have all of the labor markets, all of the applicants, and you would want to see if it changed differently for San Francisco than for others.
Right.
But that's why I chose this approach, because in some ways, it doesn't matter whether the other district had more or less positions, more or fewer positions, because we're comparing people who were affected by QTEA to people who weren't. So in this period, all of the districts had the same amount of positions, whether you were in the targeted or the non-targeted group.
Right.
They were experiencing the same labor market at that time.
Okay.
And so it controls for that difference.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I just think actually you understate the difference because your target group is impacted. If I were an experienced teacher, I would be happier to be in a district where my peers were of higher quality. So if you're attracting higher quality entry candidates as an experienced teacher, that would be an incentive to do. So I think you're saying the post-salary increase are not impacted. You're actually underestimating the difference. Difference isn't as great because they really are impacted positively.
So what you're saying is that longer term, if better teachers were attracted to San Francisco, then even better teachers would be attracted? Is that what you're saying?
Right, so the difference between the group is actually rested on a control group that are unimpacted. They're not really,
Yeah,
the impact is true greater than shown here.
Yeah, I think what's important to point out is this is a very short-term effect. This is only the first 2 years of full implementation of this study, or of the policy. And so in the long term, I think that some of that would happen, but most likely in the short term, what's happening is that teachers are responding directly to what they would expect to receive on the salary schedule. The longer term, I do think that there would be some of that. The labor market and the applicant pool would change in response to some of these changes in one school district. I think you're absolutely right. So this difference, $2,255, it might not seem like a lot, but given the distribution of salaries in the local labor market, it's pretty significant. It's a standard deviation of 0.2, and so of 0.4. So teachers that were drawn to San Francisco after the introduction of policy were really drawn from very different kinds of places. They were teachers that had a very different portfolio of districts that they were applying to. So I'm moving on now to discussing the changes to the cohorts of new hires. So the first question here is whether San Francisco hired more teachers in areas targeted by QTEA. The approach is to compare the proportion of targeted new hires before and after the policy. So more people in this targeted group who were actually hired would provide an indication, first of all, that there were more of them. Because if there are more of the targeted applicants in the pool, even if the district hires teachers randomly, just plucks them out, there will be more of them. But we know that districts generally don't hire randomly, and that if they choose on a lot of very subjective things, hopefully one of those things is how good the teacher is. And so if there are more folks in this targeted group who were hired, it also provides an indication that they were better because they were ultimately selected by the district to work in the schools. And so here what I show is the period before to after QTEA. Before QTEA, 49% of the folks that were in the new hired group were in the targeted group. After, this number increased to 54%. And again, this is a significant difference, and what it indicates is that the folks who were drawn in by the higher salary, who were in the targeted group, ended up being hired at higher rates, which again provides an indication that they may be better. And then the next question is really trying to get at a more rigorous definition of quality. We want to compare the quality of new hires before and after the policy to see if the quality of the new hires increased. So the approach here is to compare the quality as defined by a quantitative measure of teachers' contribution to student achievement. And so you'll see that quality is in quotes here, in part because, or not in part, to a very large degree, because measuring teacher quality is something that's very difficult. And I know a lot of you in this room, as well as me, think about this a lot and struggle with what it means. From a research perspective, we want to have some kind of score, some kind of measure that we can use that's readily available in the data. And so what I use here is this score that estimates the teacher's contribution to student achievement year by year. And this is in ELA and mathematics. It controls for student background characteristics and prior achievement, and includes teachers in grades 3 through 8. I do think it's important to point out, there's a lot of literature on these scores and how they function, but I think one thing that's very important to point out for this kind of research is that we don't get this score for a lot of teachers. We have it for about a quarter of the teachers, and so it should be thought of as a way to triangulate the findings that we've been seeing earlier. So an increase in the overall quality of new hires would provide a confirmation that QTEA has been effective in improving teacher recruitment. And really, I'd like to point out again that in the research this far, it shows that the pool quantity and quality increased, that more of these people were hired. And so the next step is, if all of those things are true, what happens to the quality of new hires is measured in this one way. And so what I found is that, yes, the quality of new hires does increase after QTEA, in English language arts, but not in mathematics. And so I want to walk you through my findings here.
Wow.
What I did is I compared teachers, the new hires in each year, to a stable baseline of teachers. And so the stable baseline are teachers that were there both before and after the policy and who were experienced, so their scores are pretty stable. And I want to compare so that we can correct for differences across years and compare the new hires in 1 year to this stable group of teachers in that year. And so this is the baseline of teacher quality here. And what I find is that in both before and after the policy, the new hires were of lower quality, quote unquote, than the baseline. And this makes sense. New hires are probably not going to be as good as your teachers that had been there for 5 to 10 years at the time and had really stable contributions to student achievement. But before the introduction of the policy, this number was much lower. And after the introduction of policy, the cohorts of new hires were actually much closer to this baseline of teacher quality.
For the group for 05 to 08, when you talk about the new hires, do you distinguish between people new to the district versus people new to the profession? What percent of those teachers had prior experience in other districts?
Mm-hmm.
How did that work out?
In this analysis, I don't. So this analysis includes everybody.
Okay.
In part, the rationale for that is that if there are people of all levels on the distribution of experience and quality,
right,
then the district can choose any one of them. And so it's kind of up to them. If they think a new teacher is going to be better than a teacher with 15 years of experience, that's up to their discretion. And so I included everyone in the pool because I didn't want to tease out in this analysis the difference between having none and 15 years of experience.
Okay.
It's something that I looked at and write about in my more technical report.
Okay.
So in conclusion, this research shows that the quantity of applicants in the pool went up, that the quality of the applicants in the pool went up, and that the quality of new hires went up as well. And so this really provides a comprehensive look at how teacher recruitment could change and did in San Francisco Unified School District. And so that concludes the findings on teacher recruitment, and I'm going to move on to what we found in teacher retention. So the research questions here are kind of similar, parallel to in recruitment. We want to know to what extent the teachers that were targeted by QTEA improved retention rates. But here I look at the overall salary increase, the retention bonus, and the hard-to-staff school bonus. And to refresh your memory, the retention bonuses were for teachers after their 4th and 8th year of service in the district, and the hard-to-staff school bonuses were $2,000 for teachers in 25 schools that were selected hard-to-staff. And I look at these here not in recruitment because a teacher wouldn't be probably applying to San Francisco for a bonus they wouldn't receive for 4 to 8 years, for example. They'd mostly be responding to salary. And also I want to know here if the retention of highly effective teachers improved after the introduction of the policy. So first I just want to show you descriptively what happened to teacher retention in the period before to after the policy. And so this was the first full year of implementation of the policy. And so you'll see that there was, between this year and this year, there was an increase, and then there was a decrease as a result of teacher layoffs and layoff notices. During this time, there was a lot of shuffle of positions and some forced attrition, if you will. And so again, this points to the really important point of needing a more causal approach. And so just more systematically, after QTEA, teachers were 1.56 times more likely to stay in their school. So there was an increase in retention if you just look at the raw numbers. But to isolate the effect of QTEA, we would need to dig down deeper. So again, this is the reason why we need to dig down deeper. And again, the goal is to compare teachers who are similarly affected by the economy but differently affected by QTEA. Again, I use a differences in differences approach here, where what we would probably expect is that teacher retention increases for both targeted and non-targeted group after the policy. But if QTEA had an effect, we would expect there to be a differential increase for the targeted group. So we would expect that this line would be steeper, and then the difference here would be the QTEA effect. And so that's the model that I employ in thinking about the QTEA effect across each of these different compensation elements. But for each question, to ensure that I'm comparing targeted teachers to a similar group of teachers who would be differently affected by QTEA but similarly affected by the economy, I use a slightly different approach. And so for the overall salary increase, I use the same approach as with teacher recruitment. I compare teachers with 3 to 16 years of experience. For the retention bonus, I look only at the effect of the 4th year retention bonus, and I compare teachers with 3 to 5 years of experience. So you would expect that teachers with 3 and 5 years of experience behave the same as teachers with 4 years of experience, but only the teachers with 4 years of experience are affected by the policy, and so that's how we isolate the effect of QTEA there. And then with the hard-to-staff school bonus, I compared teachers in hard-to-staff schools with teachers in a matched comparison group, or in schools that don't have the designation but look like the hard-to-staff schools on measurable characteristics. And I also limit this by the years of experience, so we're comparing teachers with only 3 to 16 years of experience. With the data I use here is San Francisco's administrative data from 2002 to 2011. And this contains a host of data which includes the amount of salary that they made both before and after QTEA, years of total teaching experience, years of service in the district, again, estimations of contribution to student achievement, and their teaching placement in each year. So the first question here is, did teacher retention improve for teachers that were targeted by QTEA? And the answer here is no. Overall, the pattern of results in our causal analyses show that QTEA did not have an effect. Teachers targeted by QTEA salary increases did not have a differential increase in retention rates above the overall trend. So again, I'd like to point out that before to after the policy, retention rates did go up for everybody in the district, but that could not be isolated to QTEA's compensation elements. The next question here is whether retention of highly effective teachers improved after QTEA. And really the reason why I looked at this is in thinking about teacher retention, there are two things that you care about. One is kind of the stabilization of schools. It's bad to have high degrees of teacher turnover in schools, no matter who leaves, because that kind of disruption can be bad for students, research is beginning to show. But you also might want to differentially retain your best teachers. And so I wanted to look at this piece as well. So the approach here is to compare the retention rates of teachers with high estimates of contribution to student achievement to those with lower estimates, and see if the retention rates were higher for the more effective teachers. This would provide a first indication that QTEA might have been more effective at retaining some of the most highly effective teachers. And so again, what I show here is no. And I want to spend a little bit of time on these charts because I think that, or these graphs, I think they're very important. What this shows is in English language arts and mathematics for teachers with low scores and high scores. And this is their retention rates before and after the policy. So what you'll see is that the highly effective teachers and the less effective teachers have different rates of retention, both before and after the policy. And consistent with what other research has shown, the highly effective teachers retain themselves at higher rates. And this is a good thing for a system. You want the teachers that are best to stay at higher rates. And they are higher both before and after the policy. So the most effective teachers respond similarly before and after the policy, but there is no differential effect. So the teachers that are highly effective don't stay at higher rates after the introduction of the policy. Although it's important to point out the levels of retention that we're getting here after the implementation of the policy. For the low effective teachers, it's about 87% retention. And for the highly effective teachers, it's about 91%. And so when you're talking about retention at such a high rate, it really makes you question if you can get any higher and if you would want to. I think that if there are probably 9% or 12% of teachers have personal circumstances that leave for a number of reasons that can't be controlled by the system. And also some of these people might be leaving that the system benefits from not having in the classroom anymore, particularly some of the teachers who score lower on their effectiveness. So summary of findings here. This study is the first to show that salary can improve the attractiveness of an urban school district in California. And this is really important. I'd like to underscore the importance of this. In California, like I pointed out at the beginning, there is a difference in the salary across the state, and the schools and districts that have the students that need the best teachers often have the lowest salaries, and that's something that we might really need to consider. So the research shows that QTEA increased the size and quality of the applicant pool, led to higher quality new hires overall, and this really is an important policy goal given what we know about unequal sorting across districts. But QTEA had no effect on teacher retention, at least in the short term, which is what I was able to look at in the first 2 years of implementation of this policy. It is possible that the economic downturn limited the policy's possible effect. Like I said, with retention rates that are so high, it's sometimes hard to get any boost on top of that. Although I'd also like to point out that it's possible that there's an unmeasurable effect here, which is kind of a QTEA effect. which is that teachers in the district want to work in a place where the voters would pass a compensation policy and where the district is thinking about rewarding teachers. And it's possible that something like that is happening in the boosts that we see after the policy, but it would be impossible to isolate causally. So I would like to put that out there as a possibility that, once the economy improves and we have more years of implementation under our belt, we can start to tease out a little bit. Again, the retention rates were too high for this differential QTDA effect. So moving on to the implications of this research. Like I've discussed, compensation is really only part of what motivates teachers. We know from a lot of literature that teachers respond very strongly to the students that they're teaching, to their workplace conditions, to the staff that teach in the school, and very importantly, to the leadership in the school. And so teachers are taking a lot of things into account, and different people value different things. There are certainly some people for whom compensation is more or less important. And so in thinking about the effect of compensation, it's important that research isolates whether compensation can be effective. But this research definitely doesn't suggest that compensation is the only lever, or even the most important lever that should be used in terms of thinking about teachers. I think that it's something that can be used as a comprehensive way of thinking about how we recruit and retain teachers into some of our hardest to staff places. Another implication of this is that when thinking about teacher recruitment and retention, it's possible that the salary increases or the compensation increases actually need to be higher for teachers to retain them rather than to recruit them. And if you think about the difference between a teacher who's deciding to leave a position and looking at other options, and a teacher who's in a position and deciding whether or not she wants to leave, when a teacher is making a decision about applying to places, she's making a decision based on guesses about what the workplace conditions might be. And so, what is it like to work with those students? What's it like to work in that neighborhood? She doesn't actually know the answer to that question. But when you're in a school, you know very intimately the facts. And it might be that if you're very unhappy and you don't like the students or the principal or your commute or whatever it is, it's going to take a lot more to convince you to stay than if you're already deciding to move and you can easily be swayed in one direction or another. And so that's something that's really, part of what we found here is that teacher retention increased during the time because of the economy. But there's an important thing to think about here too, which is, can you really move the dial on teacher retention with what's, all things considered, a pretty moderate increase? Another implication here is that district personnel practices are very important. And so what I pointed out is that the way that the applicant pool increases is then left up to the discretion of the district to take advantage of that. And what we really hope is that districts know what's best for their schools, districts and principals know what's best for their schools, and they select the best people. There's research, not in San Francisco, but in other places, that this is not always the case, and that oftentimes districts and schools don't know how to select the teachers that are going to have the best impact for the students. And so that's a really important thing to think about. Even in my framework, I lay out the options of if the district selects at random or if they select well. And that's sometimes a really big difference in the way that things are functioning at the district office. And it's something that we have to think about a lot in expanding this kind of policy. The other really important point here is that in order for improvements in the applicant pool to be effective, there have to be available positions. And we see in this research that there were pretty dramatic changes in the applicant pool during the time and a huge increase in teacher retention, which means that the district really wasn't able to take advantage of the improvements in the applicant pool to the extent that they might have been otherwise. And there is research literature to suggest that unless there are ways to improve what we call the strategic retention of teachers, that changes to recruitment aren't going to be effective. So this really points to the need for districts and for the state to think about, if we want to improve recruitment and we think that recruiting the best teachers is an area of policy concern, then we also need to think about how to make room in the districts for this new talent to come in, and for districts to think critically about, do we have a teacher quality problem? And if we do, then how do we make space for the new people that we're trying to attract to our district? Finally, there are some long-run and system-wide implications that are unclear from this research. We talked earlier about one of them, which is that there are dynamics in the labor market, both within San Francisco and elsewhere, that could really change over time. One of the big ones here is what happens if other districts respond. And so San Francisco passed a parcel tax that raised teacher salaries, but what if all of the local districts say, I'm going to raise a parcel tax, which could also be more easy with some of the proposals that are on the table to lower the voter approval rate to pass parcel taxes. And so this might be an arms race where every district is raising salary and we're not sure how to control that. There's another issue here, which is that, and this points to the issue that we were talking about, some of these salary increases could really change teacher quality in the labor market, or could change the way that people think about the district, which then could actually change the way the district operates. So it won't stay static in the way that people are considering San Francisco versus other places. Finally, and I think that this is the most important policy implication from this work, salary can be used to achieve a better distribution of teachers. The literature up until now has not shown great evidence that if there's a differential salary increase for an urban school district, that can change anything within the local labor market. And what this research shows is that a relatively moderate increase in teacher salary can change who's attracted to the district. And if the district takes advantage of that, it can change the quality of their newly hired teachers. This is a very important point, given what I laid out at the beginning about the problems that we have with distribution of teachers across the state. So really, I think that we should all think about what districts can do to think about improving their teacher workforce, but also what the state can do. If the distribution of teacher quality across our districts is a problem, and it's something that needs to be addressed, then there's a way that the state can play a role to consider how teacher salaries might be better distributed across places with different or more challenging student demographics to improve the quality of teachers that are attracted to those districts. And so on our website, it's right up here at cfa.stanford.edu, we have a host of publications, both technical and briefs, and we'll be having a PACE policy brief, which will be released very shortly, and you can feel free to contact me at any time. But now I'd love to open it up for questions and hear what you all think and have a conversation about this.
Are there questions for Heather? Yeah.
When San Francisco implemented this policy, did they make any changes to the requirements for positions or for the standards of positions?
No.
Okay.
No. So they've made some changes to the recruitment process in the central office. So they used to have a very strange way of dealing with their recruitment pool. So some of it was just they would get lots of applications, no systematic review, and they would kind of be plucked out of the pool.
Okay.
And so some of that is changing in response to some of the research that I've done with the district.
I'm assuming San Francisco has seen this.
Oh yeah.
What was their? I'm just curious if you can comment on what is their takeaway? What do they think about in terms of going forward and the worthwhile of it all?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a lot that's happening in school districts all over the state right now in terms of budget and how they're dealing with some trade-offs in money. And so something that happened with QTEA is that when QTEA passed and immediately thereafter the funds were cut dramatically by the state to San Francisco. And so they had to face a lot of hard decisions about whether to use the funds as they were designed or to reapportion the funds to protect teachers from layoff notices. So some of the policy elements were reduced quite a bit. And this is something that's larger than the compensation piece, but kind of about the policy more broadly.
Yeah.
And so now that things are beginning to improve and they have to go back to the voters, they had a 2-year ability to stop implementation as designed and reapportion those funds, and now they're going back into full implementation. And so as they think about that and about their larger human capital strategy, they're really struggling with this idea of recruitment versus retention and salary incentives in general. And the current superintendent is very focused on instructional improvement and collaboration at the school site. But the way that their human capital team is thinking about this, they want to be thinking about compensation, support, accountability, all really as the same system that supports each other. And so they like that there are positive findings in recruitment. It certainly strengthens what they told the voters they were going to do.
Right.
But they're really thinking about how they can move the dial of retention as well, or if they need to.
Yeah.
Rachel?
Did you look at benefits along with salaries? I noticed you had Oakland there as one of the lower ones, but Oakland traditionally has lower starting salaries at least and a more generous benefit package.
No, we didn't look at benefits, in part because of limitations in the data system.
Does San Francisco have a
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure how it compares to Oakland, but they do have a generous benefits package.
Yeah. When you're defining hard to staff schools, commonly that's socioeconomic. We look at English learner populations, free and reduced lunch. Sometimes we look at subject areas in STEM, particularly. Do they ever look? Have you ever come across, the answer's probably rare, at educational option schools, where you're having schools specially designed within districts, community day schools, opportunity ed, continuation education, county community schools, local court schools, those problem students as an area to incentivize, either in this case with salary or with loan forgiveness?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. What I can tell you in San Francisco is that one of the factors that they included when thinking about the hard to staff schools was actually teacher turnover. So not just do we think that these are hard to staff, but are they? And there are alternative kinds of school. San Francisco is a district and a county, so they have a lot of court schools, and they have alternative schools, community schools. They don't have an issue retaining teachers or recruiting them. They have very high levels of retention from year to year, and they have a very committed staff. And so those teachers do say that they have a difficult job, but they're kind of a different labor market, if that makes sense. So I think that it would really vary based on what a district is experiencing. You could imagine a different scenario where it is very hard to staff those schools, and hopefully the incentives or an incentive would be placed there as well, but that just wasn't the case in San Francisco.
The hard to staff bonus, was that paid for each year the teacher remained in this hard to staff school?
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice a difference in retention in those particular school sites versus other school sites within the district? Did you compare those?
I did compare them, and there was no difference. I mean, I think that drawing off of the casework that I did in the schools, you know, the teachers in what are considered the hard to staff schools acknowledged that they were getting some money, but if they were unhappy, they were struggling a lot, and they would say things like $2,000 is just not enough for me to stay at this school. So I think that if what you're trying to do is move people on the margins, if you're already happy there, then $2,000 is a bonus, and it's going to make you happy. And if you're not happy, then $2,000 might not be enough.
In the back.
Did you look at teacher retention, recruitment, any relationship to the competency or perceived competency of the principals? Having been a teacher, I know that even the best principals, even low paid district teachers, you have an arbitrary and capricious principal, the best teachers in the highest salary.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. In this pass of the research, we really wanted to think about retention system-wide, and so we didn't look at some of these other contributing factors. We were really trying to isolate the effect of compensation. But like I said, the district is thinking about QTEA in the construct of their larger human capital interventions. So one of the next areas of research that we're embarking on is trying to unpack and map better what retention looks like across the district, and whether different interventions that they have in place are affecting teacher retention, including things like leadership.
So back on the $2,000 wasn't enough. When I saw the graph on the low ELA, retention increased for them more than it did for the high ELA. And my question then was, gee, are they just a little bit happier that things aren't so bad? Because one of the reasons why they may be low ELA is they don't like the environment, they don't like the pay. You improve the pay a little, I'm a little happier and more likely to be retained.
Right, so you're saying not that group increased more after QTEA, but just what's related to the fact that higher efficient or higher effectiveness teachers have higher retention rates.
And the lower
ones
went higher because one of the things they didn't like went away.
So what this shows is that the people that are lower effectiveness, this is the retention rates.
The red line.
Right, yeah, so the lower effectiveness teachers stay at higher rates after the introduction of the policy, and so do the teachers that are higher
But
quality.
the slope of the red line is higher than the slope of the blue line.
Not significantly,
Well,
yeah. So but that's important.
Observably,
That's
though.
important. Yeah. But I do think that what you're saying is true, and there's a lot of there are mechanisms that could that drive this difference. Not necessarily the difference in the slopes, but the difference in the lines, which is that on one hand, teachers that are less effective would say, "I'm not doing a good job, and so I don't want to be in this school anymore." But on the other hand, they could say, "I'm not doing a good job because I'm not supported. And that's what's being reflected here.
Right.
And so I want to leave that school." And there's probably both of those things are happening in varying degrees in the schools that we study.
Since implementation of the QTEA, has the student academic performance improved, especially in hard-to-staff schools?
No, we haven't looked at that in a causal way, in part, and this is something that we're looking at next as well. So in part because as soon as QTEA was implemented, or the year after, a new superintendent came in and has really changed the way that they think about school improvement. And so in some of the schools that are hard to staff, they're also what's called the superintendent zone now, and they're getting a lot of new resources, including time for teacher support and collaboration. And so actually those schools have experienced pretty dramatic gains on the API. In the last year, that was a big source of news. Part of that might be associated with QTEA, part of it might be associated with the new interventions from the superintendent school, and unpacking that school improvement is what we're embarking on next.
I apologize if I missed this at the beginning. When the whole QTEA was launched, and its purpose was to attract more qualified people, how did you define that in terms of quality applicants? What are the criteria for meeting the standard of higher quality applicants?
Oh, gotcha. Okay, yeah. So what I looked at was both if more teachers applied in the targeted group, but also if the people that applied had been drawn from higher salary districts.
So not related to necessarily their preparation or years of experience.
No, and the reason why I didn't look at that is because the research generally shows that those things aren't related to other measures of teaching quality.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Jerry?
I'm having a little bit of trouble kind of getting past the concern that part of what you're picking up is due to the timing. In the sense that kind of bridging the pre and post time spans are huge increases in pink slipping in districts and and that sort of thing, which would have over that time period increased the quantity of applicants who would be looking at open positions. And I think especially in the Bay Area would have increased probably the number of applicants coming out of higher paying districts as well at the same time. So just simply on the natural, even without QTEA, it may have been that for any open position in any district in the Bay Area, there may have been more applicants over that time period and higher quality applicants, at least applicants coming out of higher paying districts.
I completely agree, and I'm going to go back to a chart here if you guys don't want to explain why I think that that's not a concern. Okay, so if what you just looked at was everyone before and everyone after the introduction of the policy, then that would be true. That would certainly be true. So if you just compared pre-QTEA, combined these two groups, and post-QTEA, and combined these two groups, any differences that you saw, you wouldn't know what it was about. You wouldn't know if it was about QTEA, or if it was about the economy, or if it was about pink slipping, or if it was about the food truck policy in San Francisco. You wouldn't have any idea what it was about. But what I do here is I say that some of these people were affected by the policy and some of them weren't. And so all of the things that happened in the economy here would have affected everyone here the same way. But the people in this targeted group gained a lot more as a result of the policy. And so they're all in the same context here, in all of the context that exists around implementation during this time, except for that these people were targeted by the policy. And we do see that they had higher average salary that they applied to. And these people who weren't affected by the policy in the same way applied to lower salary districts in general. And so this way of comparing two groups over time, one of which was affected and one of which wasn't, controls for those changes in the economy that would be a real threat to this kind of work if you didn't try to isolate that causal effect.
Well, I think I'd have to think about whether or not there's an implicit assumption built in there between the pre and the post that the proportion of kind of the higher salary folks versus non-higher salary folks is assumed to be the same as you move across those years. I mean,
So this isn't where they're coming from. It's where they're applying to, which makes a difference, I think, because it's not if they got laid off or didn't get laid off. It's once they were looking for positions, where are the places that they're looking? And in this time period, all of these people are experiencing the same positions available in the labor market as they were before.
The same open positions as would have been open in the pre-situation?
No. And so all of these people would be experiencing the same labor market, and these people would be experiencing the same labor market. And so the comparison is both across time and across the groups. And that controls for the changes that are happening in the time before and the time after.
Yeah, just in front of.
So kind of following up on that question, I had a similar thought on not in terms of the quality, but in terms of the number of applicants who were in the targeted group. I think one of the things that you mentioned was this idea that the labor market would be affecting everybody the same way. One thing that, I don't know if you thought about, was whether there could have been a differential effect because of the way layoffs are done at the school district level, where perhaps we might have had more 2 through 5. Some of the least experienced teachers might have all been in the market back looking for jobs because they had received layoffs. I don't know if you thought about that, whether that might be part of what's affecting that person.
Yeah, well, so one thing is that I did a lot of checks on the definition of the targeted group. And so I would compare, not just 2 to 15, but even chunking that down lower. What if you compare 4th to 10th year teachers, or, and it was robust to all of those checks. The other thing is that in talking with people in San Francisco and in other districts, the 1st and 2nd year teachers carried the brunt of the layoff notices. And so if you exclude those people, then there really weren't people that were much higher up that were getting layoff notices during that time.
For the retention side of this, do you distinguish between voluntary versus non-voluntary separation?
That's another thing that we're looking at next. It was hard with the existing data systems.
Okay. And
so that's why I excluded, again, the 1st and 2nd year teachers, because those teachers were more likely to be affected by layoff notices or actual layoffs. Yeah. So they're excluded from this analysis, but in the next work, that's something that we want to look at.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you maybe another future research question, but did you survey teachers as far as factors that influence this? And the cost benefit I'd be interested in, much as I care about salaries of all educators, is maybe a cost benefit of hiring a counselor, not one who does course selection, but real counseling, in comparison to spending that money on a marginal increase in salary, in that impact on, that is, we know what the impact will be. I have studies of that type doing cost benefit. Are you aware of any?
I am aware of some, not that look at such an isolated question, of course, but there's a study that came out, a PPIC study that came out a few years back that looked at a salary increase over a long time period in California compared to an investment in professional development. And they found that the salary increase did improve teacher retention rates, but that the increase in teacher support was actually more cost effective. The increase in teacher support was more cost effective than the salary increase over the same time period. But I agree, it's an important thing. And to go to your earlier comment about did you ask teachers? Yes, we did in the case studies and on the survey. Some of the survey questions did pick up on it. We asked teachers before and after to tell us what played into their decisions, either to stay or to go or to come. And when we compared those responses, there were more teachers who said compensation mattered after. But generally, when you ask teachers point blank, did you respond to compensation, they do not say yes. In part, it's the culture around teaching. You know, it's everybody who's a teacher. You know, I don't do it for the money. You hear that a lot. But it's also a job. And so to try to unpack some of the personal reasons that people went into teaching, especially when we're talking about 42,000 versus 110,000. You know, this is not, it's not a sacrifice that's easy for anybody to make if you're working to make money, which, you know, we all do.
Any final questions for Heather? Chuck?
I just have, and I don't know if you teased it out or if you could even tease it out, but the decision to become a teacher versus go to work at Intel.
It's a fantastic question.
Was it impacted by the slight salary increase that QTEA?
Yeah, it's something that would be difficult to look at with data in just one school district. It's an important question, and I think that moving forward, we need to think about ways to get at that. My sense from the literature is that the ways that teachers are inspired to become teachers have to be a little bit more systematic, because if you're in college and you say, I want to be a teacher, and the district salaries in San Francisco are really high, so I'm going to put all my eggs in that basket. That's not the way that the labor market works. And I think that people know that. And certainly a lot of the lore around teaching right now for new teachers is good luck going to get your credential, you'll never get a job. Right? And so not only you'll never get a job, but then I'm going to decide, I'm going to plan on getting a job in this district. It's kind of it's a leap of logic.
Okay, I want to thank Heather and thank you all for coming today. And we'll still be around for a few minutes if you have additional questions.
Good.